Well, welcome to our community. Susie Thomas with you this morning. Happy to welcome Johan Wang. He is the author of Reclaiming Political Roots. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Johan, I'm going to be honest. I try so hard to not get political on this program, so we are breaking all the rules, and I'm looking forward to doing it a little bit and getting an idea of what you're writing about. First of all, what do you mean by reclaiming political roots?
So let's first define the word political.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Let's define the word political. That actually was what I wanted to know.
Yeah, because, even the way that you started off, like you try not to get political on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of people don't try to get political because the word politics has become such a dirty word today. It's almost worse than the F word, and it's so divisive. And it's a conversation stopper for many people, right?
Well, we're told if there's two things you're never supposed to talk about in good company, that would be politics and religion.
Right. And that's because oftentimes people associate the word politics with American politics, which is either you're on the Republican side or the Democratic side, and that itself was not that bad a few years ago, but
right.
Today the climate is so divisive that even this is splitting Christians apart. Conservative versus liberal Christians and so on.
Johan, we are seeing families not speaking to each other because of political divide.
Yes.
Why is that from your perspective?
So, I try to address that in the book. So for me, the word politics is not about American politics. If we get to what it essentially the word is really about politics is about the way we organize our lives, our society, our community together. How do we come together as a society? And so that involves often finding what are the goods that we hold in common as a society or community. And now, unfortunately, what I think the church has done over several hundreds of years, and it happens slowly and gradually, is to kind of give up many of the common goods that we used to have to the state, to the government. That's what ended up happening. And so a few examples of that would be that, the church in the past was really a pioneer in providing welfare, healthcare,
right.
education, providing justice. These were the common goods that we used to hold. And now, slowly, we kind of gave them over to the state, in our case, America. And so now we expect the state to provide these things. And so it's no wonder that now a lot of Christians and non-Christians alike are so divided on, the debate is centered on how the state is supposed to provide healthcare, welfare, education, justice, and so on. But what I'm arguing in the book is that we have to, at least for Christians, we have to bring this back to the church. It's okay to have disagreements, but hey, let's have a meaningful disagreement on how the church is supposed to provide these things rather than the state. And actually, I think this way we would actually come together. Conservatives and liberals alike would actually come together and actually be creative about how the church can start doing these things again that it used to do.
I had heard a while back, this would be years ago now, that if every church was able to adopt 7 families who are currently on welfare, and some churches would be able to do not that many, but other churches would be able to do many more than that. But if you divide it up and every church adopted 7 families to help them get back on their feet, providing the kinds of things they needed to be able to make them self-sufficient, that we could there would be no need for welfare. For one thing, I think of all the money that goes into welfare, that could be going towards other things, or be back in their own homes, being able to provide for themselves because they're not getting so much taken out of your paycheck. But can you imagine if the church truly was the church and saw people struggling, needed a hand up, not a hand out? Your thoughts on that, to be able to adopt some families?
Exactly. And you know, the church also was, I mean, many of the hospitals still have Christian names, even though they are not very Christian, because the church was also a pioneer in healthcare. The church was a pioneer in education as well. Many of the universities were founded by Christians in the Middle Ages. And so, and that meant that a lot of science and research was from a Christian perspective initially.
Right.
And so we have lost all of that. And now it all became a secular thing that is completely unrelated to religion. And so now another problem. So one problem is the divisiveness that we see between so-called conservative and liberal Christians. But another one is that Christians have a very hard time relating various facets of their lives because everything was taken over by the secular institutions. So,
what do you mean?
So, for instance, we have a lot of people who can't relate how their work, their family, economics, politics, science, technology, how does it all relate to your faith? A lot of people don't have a clue, you know, whereas in the past, it all fell under the church, right? So everything was given meaning under the church. So this is a big problem, and so I'm trying to address all of that. And aside from the fact that many young people are leaving the church,
right,
disillusioned, and part of that I think is because they find more meaning and community in their companies or corporations or in their political party. And so I'm trying to address all those three issues by saying, look, our primary political body should not be the state or some corporation that we work for. Our primary political body was supposed to be the church all along. And so I think that our primary way that we organize ourselves and we come together as a society or community, at least for Christians, should be the church. And so I'm trying to bring all these pieces together. And I frankly, I see that this is the way to move forward if we want to solve all these three problems.
So the meaning of political is not the meaning that has somehow it's morphed into, but you want to get back to it being people and how we relate to one another and how we're organized together.
Exactly.
This is fascinating because you didn't just write this book this afternoon. When did you feel moved to write this book? How long have you been working on this?
Well, the research and the exploration took a long time, took several years. And honestly, I mean, I went to Duke Divinity School, and I graduated in 2012. I wasn't exploring a book at that time, but I had just come out of a class from Stanley Hauerwas. And the book is highly influenced by Stanley Hauerwas, you know, and he's kind of famous in certain theological circles. But he has a very robust and beautiful ecclesiology, and that just means the doctrine of the church, right? What the church should be. So just reading that, and then also seeing the increasing political divisiveness, and just seeing the problems, like why are young people? I'm a millennial myself, you know, so I'm one of the older millennials, but still, I consider myself young.
You don't have to apologize for being a millennial, but that's all right. Yes, right.
And so I see that I myself can witness a lot of young people leaving the church and being disillusioned.
Yes.
And I myself have been disillusioned somewhat, but I still love the church, right? But instead of leaving, right, it's about looking at what are the problems and having kind of a theological lens. And I also watch the news a lot and read the news a lot. And so putting it all together, right, I came up with this idea.
Well, I think what's so fascinating is you've been working on it for years, but never has it been more timely than today. If there's one thing that I thought would unite us as a country, it would be going through a global pandemic together. But look how political and politicized that became, and even that has become divisive, whether you wear a mask or you don't wear a mask.
Right.
It's amazing to me, and that could be because it's an election year, so we can kind of count on everything getting politicized as two camps kind of set up wanting to get power in some way. But it's fascinating to me because normally they would say nothing unites like a common enemy. And when we've got that common enemy as being this bug that we all want to see defeated, but no, even that has divided us. Your thoughts on that within the church? What can we do?
Yeah. So on the pandemic, I mean, obviously this book was written before the pandemic,
Yes.
um, but is the church doing certain things in the pandemic? Of course it is. So you hear of Christians, and the church is doing things quietly on the background, right? Without getting a lot of notice. So you have some Christians delivering meals for vulnerable people, people that are vulnerable and going into grocery stores and stuff, right? Like older
Yes.
people, right? So sometimes there are church members delivering meals for people in need. And you have many nurses and doctors who are Christians on the front lines and doing what they do because of their faith, right? Now, at the same time, though, and by the way, even in the ancient past, there used to be pandemics are nothing new, right? In the ancient past, there were pandemics, and it was Christians at the time. Other people were just abandoning even their own family members to die on the streets for fear of infection. And it was Christians who risked their lives. They saw this as their calling because Jesus was a healer.
Yes.
And went out there and picked up these people at risk of themselves getting infected and took care of them. And many Christians died getting infected, right? But they were the ones who took on this mission. Now, today, though, part of the problem is that, yes, this is happening among Christians, but it's mostly, at the end of the day, when on the media, right, how does it come out? It just comes out as this big secular blurb like, hey, we love nurses and doctors, but in the name of whom are we doing this, right? And it's not always clear that it's always on the name of Christ. It's just kind of, that message just kind of gets lost, right? And so actually who we work for matters, and institutions do matter. So if hospitals today had still some Christian identity, then this will come out as much better witnessing. But so I think Christians need to, and a lot of Christians are just cooped up at home with not much, being able to do not that much, right?
Well, lately,
and
yes.
So we need to, Christians need to really come together, and I mean, perhaps after this pandemic is over, but we need to come together and think, maybe we may not be able to do that much during this particular pandemic, but still, we need to come back and think, how can we recover some of the institutions and systems that we used to have so that when the next crisis strikes, we'll be much better prepared to be better witnesses.
It's been a learning experience, hasn't it? We found out where we're lacking, and it is... it's been an interesting time to be able to kind of reassess, all right, reevaluate, all right, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What do we need to do better? We're speaking with Johan Hwang. He's the author of Reclaiming Our Political Roots, and we'll be back after these words. You're listening to Our Community. Welcome back to Our Community. Susie Thomas speaking with Johan Hwang, the author of Reclaiming Our Political Roots. And we've talked about what does political mean, but let's look at a couple more of those words, reclaiming. How do we do that, Johan? What do you think we need to do? It's one thing to say we need to get together and do this. What would that look like day by day?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So that's where I think some people think like, man, how can we actually do this in practice? And a lot of books point out a lot of problems, but it's hard to offer solutions, right? And by the way, any solution that I offer, and solutions are offered in Chapter 5, they have to be rooted back in history, in the Bible, and also I would say what some Protestants would cringe at this word, but church tradition. There's a lot to learn from church tradition, whether we're Catholics or not. Yes, there's a lot of bad things that happen in church history, but also there's
Right.
a lot of good things too.
Yes.
And so we need to look back at the Bible, and we also need to look at the good aspects of church tradition. Um, and so when you find what you find in the Bible is that um, ancient Israel was always political, well, naturally because they were a nation, but theologically speaking, the church is an extension of or a continuation of Israel. Like we are the true Israel in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
And the ancient church, the early church used to share all their possessions. So it can't get any more political than that.
Right.
And then later on, the monasteries, encouraged work, right? They did work to some extent, and then you have the establishment of universities and so on. So what I'm getting at here is that now we have to look back at the past, but we cannot just be a copycat of what the past was. Obviously, we have to adapt to new circumstances, right? So one of the things that I say in proposing solutions is like, okay, if the government ended up taking over some of these roles, how can we reclaim some of these roles again?
Mm-hmm.
So if
Mm-hmm.
we look at the example of education, right? We just assume today that schools have to be public and we just have to send our kids to public schools. Well, not necessarily. Like the church used to provide education. Now, today we have Christian schools out there, private Christian schools, and I happen to work at one. But unfortunately today, because we don't tend to put all these ideas together, Christian related entities without having too much affiliation to a particular church. I mean, some of them do, but and so they happen to charge enormous amounts of tuition, and they have to, right? They often charge like $15,000 a year, right? And so, unfortunately, only the very wealthy Christians can afford these schools.
Mm.
Well, what I'm saying is, okay, on this area of education, okay, if the church used to provide education, why don't churches gather together and decide, like, hey, we can provide from the offerings, from the reserves that churches have, we can decide to provide at least partially part of the tuition for families that want to send their kids to these Christian schools.
Wow.
And it can be merit-based, like financially merit-based as well, right? So just like the government offers benefits and it taxes people, what are offerings really? What are the tithes? In the past, when the temple collected offerings, those were taxes, So we need to think kind of in political ways too. We just think that the offering is just like voluntary and like, oh, whatever my heart feels like. That's not the way it was in the past. People have lost the sense that the tithe is a duty. But when you tend to think politically, like, hey, the church is my primary political body, well, those are taxes that I pay to my church, and my church is also supposed to provide certain benefits and certain goods.
You have such a positive way of saying words that usually trigger folks, political and taxes. Those are usually triggers for a lot of folks, but you're saying it, giving it from the heart to other people.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one way that we can realistically practice. Hey, how can we go back to the church in Acts when they held their things in common? Well, it may not be realistic for a lot of people to give up all their possessions, but if you're part of a church and you're giving your tithes to that church, and the church distributes those goods as it should, rather than, and some churches are struggling to even barely pay for building maintenance.
Yes, right.
Because people don't pay their tithes. I think the average American pays like 2 or 3% rather than 10% to their church. And so what would it look like if people actually looked at their church as their primary political body rather than the nation state? and then the church would actually be in a better position to really rebuild some of the institutions it used to have.
You're talking
And
about a family, a church family.
exactly. And family is not just getting along. See, a lot of people think, okay, the church should be a loving community, and we all agree with that. But the word love often gets watered down to, hey, let's hang out, let's watch a movie together. All of that is really great, but there needs to be a lot more than that. Love also entails political and economic, and that's what the church used to be, and that's, I think, what the command to love means.
When you talk about roots and getting back to our political roots, our country, as you said, has some things that we are not proud of. Not everybody would want to go back to the 1700s, 1800s, when we think about certain people groups who were completely mistreated. How do you reconcile that?
Well, when I say our roots, see, I do not mean our American political roots.
There we
I mean
go.
our church political roots.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that can lead to misunderstandings, but and by the way, the subtitle of the book, so the title is Reclaiming Our Political Roots, but then the subtitle is Rethinking Church in Nationalist Times. So, we kind of live in, it's not just Trump, but all over the world, I think, there's been a resurgence of nationalism. And so we need to think like, hey, it's not just about the nation state here. And by the way, I have nothing against loving the country, and even this is not a Republican issue. It's also a very democratic issue too.
It's a people issue.
And right, there's nothing wrong about loving the country, but let's be careful that doesn't become idolatry. When Christians are fighting with each other about what is best for the country, that means that has almost become idolatry. The church should be higher than the nation for Christians. Like, America should not be the savior, but it's Christ through his church.
Yes.
And so that's really what I mean. It's our roots, it's our church roots, our Christian roots, not really talking about our American roots. And because America has a lot of messed up things in its history.
Yes. So when you're looking at the title, be sure to read the subtitle too. We tell everyone, so because that's where you're really going. That's the heart of this. Johann, as a millennial, and you see that so many young people are leaving the church and looking more for community, how do we embrace them and call them back to church as a group of Christ followers?
So I think the church has to have a very compelling mission. And that's what draws young people to certain startups. Like, for example, today, this whole big thing is social entrepreneurship, right? So millennials are people that can't stay in one company for too long. They have, after 5 years or 3 years, they end up leaving, right?
Right.
Part of that is that their dissatisfaction with not just their boss, but with their company, the mission of the company, that they want to, actually, this is a good thing. It may seem like a bad thing, like, oh, these people cannot be loyal to anyone. But what they are searching for is, like, I want to work for a good cause. I don't want to just work for this money-making machine that just exploits people in the environment, right? And so millennials are this energetic group and so, yeah, companies have a hard time keeping them, but once they find the right company that has a good cause rather than just making money, they stay there, they love it there, they build a community there, and they find that, unfortunately, more meaningful than the church. And one of the criticisms that I point out today is that when the church has given up many of these roles that it used to have to the government or to the corporations, then the church is left with not that much of a mission. It's left with, I mean, this is an exaggeration. I do point this out in the book, but it is an exaggeration, but albeit it's based on truth, that the church is kind of left as a social club and a therapist. So, I mean, I hope that doesn't offend anyone. I mean, it is an exaggeration.
Go ahead and explain more what you mean.
Truth. Like we gather together on Sundays, and we have community, but and then the sermons are mostly about improving our lives to some extent, and those are great things. Those are not bad things. The church should continue doing those things, but the church used to be a lot more than just that.
Yes.
And that has been taken over by corporations and the government and so on. So, one of the solutions that I explore also is like, how can the church be once again involved in economic matters? Because we have kind of like dropped the ball on that one. And now we may not be able to do much about currently existing companies, such as Microsoft or Goldman Sachs. It will be very hard for Christians to go in there and change the culture of a given company. But the church can do something about startups, and that's very big among millennials too. It's like, hey, if you're a Christian and you want to start a business, like, how about the church
help them along,
get involved there in some creative ways, so that if you're involved at the inception of a company, then you can shape the culture really well. And then everyone involved in that company, all the future hires, right? There's a culture set that people will find meaning there, Christian values and truly meaning there, rather than just, hey, let's just pursue profits. And so
we see that.
How is that done?
There are certain companies that you can tell that people of faith have completely shaped the culture of the company. I'm thinking Chick-fil-A and so many others. There definitely is a different vibe when you walk into those doors. You can sense it. You've really given us a lot of food for thought. I know there are pastors that are going to be very interested in picking up this book and reclaim political roots and reignite this younger generation and the younger families that are the future of our country. It's Reclaiming Our Political Roots, author Johan Wang. I'm so sorry our time is out. I would love to talk with you more. Can we do that another time?
Absolutely.
Well, God bless you, Johan. Thank you so much for joining us in our community today.
Thank you so much for having me.